Welcome back to Almost Nowhere, the podcast where actuaries, data scientists, and industry leaders explore what's next in risk, resilience, and innovation. I'm Alicia Burke from the CAS Institute. For our episode today, I was joined by my co-host, Max Martinelli, in Austin at the CAS Annual Meeting. We had such a great conversation with our guest, DJ Falkson, that it ran a bit long and we didn't get a chance to film our intro. DJ is an actuarial leader who built and led pricing teams across multiple lines of insurance, most recently as actuarial director at Lemonade. Alongside that work, he's written and presented on how zoning, housing policy, and the migration patterns influence exposure, affordability, and the insurance market itself. Now, on with the show.
DJ, before we get into the serious stuff, and there's some serious stuff in this episode, we're in Austin at the CAS Annual Meeting 2025. It's a city famous for its zoning debates. Just curious if you had any thoughts about Austin in general.
Austin's a great city, super fun, great food. I haven't been here in like 6 years, but I always have a great time. I got to see live music 3 nights in a row, both at just local bars where I could just talk to some locals, which I always like to do on these trips. You can get a little actuaried out. It's fun to kind of meet some locals. And then I went to a bigger show at the Stubbs Amphitheater. On the zoning front, Austin is a very interesting story, and maybe we'll get into this more. But they have seen their kind of techie and popularity as a city just blow up during the 2010s. And along with that, of course, people wanted to move here. They were starting to bid up the price of housing, got very unaffordable. And so I think starting in the late 2010s, Austin government started to try and make some changes, allowing a lot more dense building throughout the city, more kind of duplexes, triplexes. Fast forward to today, you can see a lot of building around us in this kind of dense downtown, but I think there's a bit more spread out throughout the city. They're starting to see rents come down. So some of us in other cities who are into this stuff are really pointing to Austin as a success story. If you bring more supply of housing online, you do eventually start to see rents maybe not come down, but flatline and at least increase slower relative to incomes, which is really kind of the important part. Mm-hmm. You might still see rents go up in places, but if it's less than incomes are going up, then it's less of a share of what you're making.
So you've talked about how actuaries can't just model risk. They have to understand the systems that create it. So what first led you from your traditional actuarial work into exploring housing affordability and urban design?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to go back really far to answer this, maybe too far, but I'm from the Washington, D.C. metro area. Folks settled there in the 80s. They lived in D.C. and then they moved out to the suburbs, and that's where I grew up. So you end up, kind of swimming in the waters of politics and government contracts and sort of just learning about that a bit. My dad had a PhD in political science. And when I was in college, I studied economics with a focus on public policy. I didn't have any actuarial internships during college. My one kind of main internship was at Urban Institute, a public policy think tank. And I thought I was going to maybe go that direction, which generally requires going to grad school, getting a PhD if you want to move into kind of fellowship roles at these places. And I even took the GRE, and I was kind of at that phase in your senior year when you're deciding what you want to do with your life. I had no actuarial exams at the time. My dad kind of convinced me not to go into academia, which I'm ambivalent about. I think you've probably interviewed some PhDs that have had great experiences and some that are regretting it, but I decided not to. I had heard about this actuarial profession back then, and so then I started to look into it more, and after graduating took a couple of exams and got my first actuarial job, and then the rest is history for the last 15 years or so. But I've maintained an interest in the economic policy area. And especially after I finished my exams and I had a lot of free time on my hand, I started to kind of reconnect with the topic a bit more, keeping up with national news. This was during Trump won, so there were lots of twists and turns to follow. And I came out of that period thinking that wasn't such a great use of my time, just what are the twists and turns of the Robert Mueller investigation, things like that. But a few years later, I had moved to New York, wanted to really connect with the topics and started, reading econ Twitter and the various, bloggers, Substackers, and they were all writing about housing affordability post-COVID. It's something that we had seen getting worse in some areas in the 2010s, but then after COVID really became kind of a big issue in the major coastal metros and suburbs where a lot of people want to live, but even throughout the US as people were migrating away from those cities to get more space and starting to bid up the price of housing everywhere. And at a very 10,000 foot view, the problem there is a lack of supply to meet the demand throughout the country. And that used to be very concentrated in certain areas, but now it's been kind of spread throughout. So it was kind of like I started encountering these topics like zoning, and that it wasn't just a post-COVID. It was a post-COVID phenomenon that got supercharged, but there are these decades-old systems that have limited the market's ability to provide the housing that people want. And so I started diving deeper. I'd also done some volunteering. I had finished my exams and a master's. I kind of wanted to do something that was, I guess, good for society. So in New York, I also got involved a bit with local advocacy groups that were trying to bring more attention and action from people and from local electeds on these issues. So I'll shout them out specifically. Open New York in particular is one. YIMBY group in New York, probably the most prominent one. I'll define the acronyms because I know that's what you're supposed to do on podcasts. It's Yes in My Backyard, and I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit more. But trying to change the conversation around housing development in New York and to make housing development a little bit more equitable because it's always been concentrated in certain areas, but not throughout cities. And I really started learning about the issues, getting involved, canvassing for political candidates that were good on these things, giving testimony at local hearings in favor of things, because often these local hearings were often people saying, no, I don't want that big building going up near me, or even that small building going up near me. I don't want the construction, the noise, and I think it's going to change the character of my neighborhood. What we kind of learn in these advocacy groups is how to kind of push back on that and to say, actually, pro-growth policies are good for a city in the long term, and they're good for families, and neighborhood character is nebulous and not something you can just kind of define and freeze in place.
But before we get into the NIMBYism, because I think when I was trying to research, because you wrote a article on this, you presented at the annual on this, and I was trying to kind of pull the counter perspectives to see if you could maybe, say what you would respond to in that. I'm curious, how much do you think of it is actually policy and NIMBYism, as opposed to just the fact that after the Great Recession, we stopped building? There's been a lot of skilled labor trends where the median age is increasing and people aren't inflowing into these industries. So the cost of labor is more expensive. Building materials got very expensive during the pandemic. Supply chains were broken. So someone might say, okay, like we have other fish to fry before we get to the NIMBYism. What would your counter be?
I'd say it all hurts. So whether a building gets built or not, a builder will do their financial modeling. They'll look at the cash flows out, how long it's going to take to build, what it's going to cost, and they're going to look at the rents they're going to get if it's a rental building, or what they're going to get if they're selling, condos or even a single family home. And they'll look at, does it pencil out, is a term that I learned from the housing expert people, which is essentially, are you going to make money or lose money on this? Because if you look like you're going to set a bunch of money on fire, you're not going to build the thing. And so the cost structures, I think, are what you're getting at. There's hard costs, there's soft costs, there's land costs. A lot of what I'm talking about with NIMBYism, zoning, really gets more into the soft costs, which is you have to hire very good planners and architects and lawyers to navigate this kind of complex system of zoning rules and upzonings and environmental impact assessments. And the timelines are often nebulous in that approvals could be 5 or 6 months, or it could get a lot of local attention, and the local city council member who has sign off could think, oh, this is a political liability for me. I'm going to quash this or make it much more difficult. And then your timeline's 5 or 6 years. What some of you're getting at, I think, is hard costs, which is labor, building materials, and that also hurts. I can't speak to the relative percentages. That's getting a little bit outside of my area of expertise. On the global financial crisis, we did have a glut of building in certain regions, definitely. You kind of heard about the big houses that were just sitting empty with underwater mortgages. And then it did kind of kill the builder industry for a while. And there was kind of this simmering undersupply for the next few years that people didn't really recognize, as not much was being built. And it only really crept up in the really high demand, high cost coastal metros, like San Francisco is where these YIMBY-NIMBY fights were kind of the biggest, earliest, and New York. But I think we only really recognized the countrywide underbuilding until post-COVID, when a lot of pent-up demand kind of spread out from those coastal areas to other parts. So I don't think I answered all of there's actually one other, on the hard costs. There's a lot of interesting research around the construction industry and its productivity, because you can look at, actuaries, data scientists. A lot of us, we've become more productive over time as tooling has gotten better. The construction industry, not an expert again, but I think it's still very analog in a lot of ways, like a lot of paper and non-interconnected systems. Also, even construction technologies. Manufactured homes have actually gotten way better and way more sophisticated, but there are a lot of rules that are preventing them being built and kind of rolled out throughout the country. So there's a few different angles to your question, and there's good criticisms that it's all kind of NIMBYism. But I'd say anything that makes housing either illegal to build or more unaffordable to build makes it either more expensive if it does get built, or it kills a lot of smaller projects.
Would you agree actuarial models and urban systems are describing similar things just from a different angle?
I don't think so. So I guess I'll focus on risk models. I'm pricing actuary by trade, so that's kind of what I've dealt with over time. Pricing risk models, we're looking at where our exposures kind of already are and which are generating claims and which aren't, and how big they are, and what are the kind of building characteristics or user characteristics or geographic characteristics that are predictive of that. I think a key point I want to make with the housing and urbanism stuff is that it's far upstream of the exposures. We kind of just see where the exposures are and we deal with them. There are all these forces that are dictating whether people can live in an area and build families there or not, and thus where they decide to migrate and settle and then accumulate assets that the insurance industry needs to cover. So with risk models, I would say no. Maybe some actuaries may be involved more in portfolio planning or looking like multi-year, where is our book going to grow and where is it not? And that's where I think some of this kind of social science and urbanism could maybe enrich some of those views, the portfolio management side. But a lot of times, I put it maybe not nicely, insurers we're kind of bottom feeders in that we cover the risks that people are taking, how they're living, where they're living, how they're getting around. Are they driving or taking public transit? What types of businesses they're owning and where those businesses are located. We kind of take that as it falls down to us. It's not a perfect analogy because we also enable all that stuff to happen. So it's kind of more of an ecosystem. I'm trying to get insurers to kind of pay attention to the forces that are driving where the exposures accumulate in the first place.
We've been called a lot of things. Bottom feeders feels new.
That's a new one.
Yeah, and maybe not the worst we've ever been called, but
bottom feeders are an important part of ecosystems.
Yeah. How did we get here? So, we've already talked about the zoning, the building codes, the restrictive covenants. Like, how did we get here? When did this start in American history? Because maybe we can learn from the past and kind of project of where this is going.
Yes, it's really interesting. And maybe I can make some, book recommendations, things like that at the end, depending on how much of an American history of cities, history of public policy and government you are. You can go pretty deep. But before there was zoning, and the first zoning code was 1916 in New York, one thing that really distinguished America and Americans from, say, Europe, the old world, was our mobility. People could really move to opportunity here and frequently did. You go back to early U.S. times with westward expansion towards opportunity, settling in farms in kind of the most fertile areas. And then you get closer to the late 1800s when we started urbanizing and the Industrial Revolution was happening and people increasingly moved towards cities and urbanities. And that really distinguished us. In Europe, you would often stay put for hundreds of years where your family or clan was located. And it was kind of a very hereditary structure. But the U.S. really allowed mobility. That started to change in the 20th century when some people got really wealthy in cities and started to like aspects of them and not like other aspects of them. So before some of these kind of zoning overlays, you would see businesses next to homes, early offices, things like that. And some looked at that and said, this is an incoherent jumble, and we need to impose a little bit of order on this. And that really, was the impetus for the 1916 zoning in New York. In California, you saw Berkeley, I think, was the first to have a single family only zoning. There was a racial and class element from the start to this as well. In California, there was huge Asian immigrant populations. Lots of them were operating laundries, and people used those laundry services because they were cheap and they were useful. But they started moving closer to the residential communities, and some people didn't like seeing all those Asian immigrants around. And so some of the early zoning then was to not allow businesses near homes, or to explicitly say the laundries can only be, on this side of the road. And then, fast forward to the Depression and then the post-war years, we started seeing the patterns of suburban development. There was a lot of financing for builders to build these new communities, and the growth of the automobile kind of enabled it as well. And you had people coming back from the war and needing space for their families. A lot of government policy at the time tied that financing explicitly to certain zoning regimes, typically, single family only, low density. And so a lot of these communities, the foundation of them was they have to be built a certain way, and they're not really allowed to evolve if, somebody wanted to build cheaper housing modalities like apartments. And that's what the US still kind of looks like to a degree. I don't want to say we haven't changed at all since the, 30s to 60s suburbanization, but that's the pattern you see in the US that you don't necessarily see everywhere else. Some interesting things so in the middle of the century, there was a lot of kind of modernist planners who were looking at cities and trying to build these kind of big, grand developments. They were looking at kind of mixed use areas with lower income tenements and saying, we don't like that disorder, which was, again, there was often a class and a racial element to it. So you hear the term, urban renewal from that period, when there was a lot of bulldozing of neighborhoods to build these new developments, which sometimes didn't even materialize and just left kind of gaping holes in cities. So that accelerated the suburban development, but it also created a backlash, which was actually, I would say, positive at first, which was citizen groups, neighborhoods started fighting back against this, organizing and saying, we don't like these planners coming in and saying what you're going to do to our neighborhood, bulldozing it or whatever. Jane Jacobs is a name you hear a lot in New York with Greenwich Village, where they kind of pushed back against an urban renewal program back then, and eventually got people elected and gained these tools of citizen review, environmental review, where all of a sudden local groups and citizenry had a lot of power to push back at local councils against development plans. And you could argue this was good. So, we don't want that factory being built right next to our neighborhood because of all the noxious fumes it's going to create. We don't want that highway to be built through our neighborhood because it's going to split it in half and destroy it, which is something we saw a lot of. And those tools, they accompanied the growth of environmentalism in the 70s. You saw the EPA get started under the Nixon administration. They've kind of evolved over time to be able to be used against anything. So originally it was environmental review, which, necessitates lawyers. It extends timelines, being used against, a factory or something. You now start to see them being used against apartment buildings and even green energy projects and infrastructure like wind farms, where groups that are highly motivated and can afford the expensive lawyers use these levers of process to kind of gum up the works. It relates to zoning because often it's rezonings that are needed to build things, and they can extend that process out using these tools. So we kind of have these old systems of development that were imposed, and then these tools that were layered on top of them to make it very hard to change. And that's what's kind of caused a lot of this kind of demand versus supply imbalance on housing and also other infrastructure projects. That's a short history. There's you could go way deeper on it. Stop there.
Yeah, no, your next question lines up perfectly with that, and I'll have a follow-up for you afterwards.
It sounds like some of these policies, they don't break necessarily along political lines, not very neatly. Could you comment on that? And in particular, why are, say, blue coastal cities often the most restrictive?
Yes, this is where you have to give the politics alert. In general, it's just funny. I think actuaries, depending on where you live, are kind of apolitical, and I never would hear it talked about in the office. So this is an actuarial podcast, but we're going to talk about politics a bit. And it's because it's hard to avoid with this issue. Forgetting about how we often think of politics and what comes out in the news, a lot of it's just the distribution of power in society and what can get done and what doesn't get done. So it is kind of inherently political in nature when you talk about matters of land use, because land is limited, and valuable land close to the high-performing, high-growth cities is especially limited and valuable. So I mentioned, the environmentalism of the 70s. A lot of this was liberal progressives who were caring a lot about the destruction of green space, the preservation of what you would consider a good environment. And they also were living in suburbs, though. And they liked suburbs because they had a lot of green space. You could look at cities and see it as a gray concrete wasteland and say, we don't want to become anything like that. We like our neighborhood character as is. And that's actually where you see these tools of process being used most heavily. So the housing affordability issues being greatest in New York and San Francisco, they're also where the land use regimes, environmental impact assessments, all of these kind of process issues being worse. And it's very interesting politically because a lot of these suburbanites are dyed-in-the-wool liberals or progressives. They would define themselves that way. And the classic example you'll see is they may have a sign in their yard that says, Black Lives Matter, all are welcome here. We are a welcoming community. And they'll have a sign next to it that says, fight this apartment building that they want to build down the street. And, if the cost to live in the so-called welcome community is, say, $4,000 or $5,000 a month for an apartment, if you're talking about New York or San Francisco, kind of tells you all you need to know. And then conversely, in, redder parts of the country, they often are building more. We just pointed to Texas where things are a little bit easier here. I've been talking about housing a lot, but on green energy, Texas builds way more wind and solar than liberal progressive California and New York. And a lot of these process issues are the reason for it. There are some other aspects when you talk about left opposition to development. It's hard to avoid the topic of gentrification. A lot of neighborhoods, they don't like development because over the last 20 years, as cities sort of became popular to live in again with tech jobs and more innovation, and a lot of often, whiter, wealthier yuppies, if we want to call them that, moving back into city centers. They were either driving up the prices of existing housing or necessitating the construction of big, dense housing that really changes neighborhoods very rapidly. So you see opposition to building within cities on the left because of opposition to gentrification. But on the right-wing side of things, I don't want to use too much shorthand because it's hard to categorize big groups of people. Often there is also opposition to construction, and it's because they don't want those people living close to them. And they know what apartments mean. It means lower income people. That's something you see in some parts of the country as well, like redder suburbs. But again, some redder parts of the country have also been very open to removing zoning and changing their land use regimes. Montana is kind of a shining example that has really kind of allowed, much relaxed zoning, much more building. And the aspect there that's interesting is zoning is, among other things, it is allowing you to tell your neighbor what they can do with their land. Because if they want to sell to a developer who might want to build a duplex or triplex or something denser, if they're not allowed to build it, then they're not going to come to you and buy your land to do it. And so there's kind of a free markets aspect of this as well, which is very interesting, which is if you relax all these rules, people can just do more things more freely with their house or their land. And so that's why it really doesn't fall neatly on left-right. On the pro-housing side or the YIMBY side, it's not quite right to just call it centrist, but it is a growing recognition that we have a lot of red tape that makes it hard to get things done. And cutting red tape used to be very right-wing coded. I think for many years, even going back to the Reagan years, that's when the kind of conservative antipathy towards government really became big. I think, what was his quote? The 8 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Yeah. And so as kind of a backlash to that, a lot of liberal groups and people who work for the government or are close to that see regulation as good. And in a lot of cases, it is. A lot of regulations are written in blood, and we have them for a reason. But when you have them all combined like this in a very dense thicket, and you have motivated groups that can kind of use the power of the legal system to gum up the works on building housing or infrastructure, you start to kind of realize, well, maybe we do need to cut through some of this thicket of red tape. And more generally, some groups on the left or center left, as you want to call it, just look at our bluest areas and they look at the outcomes and say, well, what's the point of this system if it's just producing housing unaffordability? It's pushing people further out to the fringes. The only people that can afford to live here increasingly are the yuppies or the homeowners who have been here for 40, 50 years and have owned their home. And so it's kind of more of a systems thinking view of how do we actually design a better system. It's not getting rid of government. It's actually allowing the bureaucracy to function better.
Yeah. And I'll say our audience, I think, is sophisticated enough to know that these are, simple generalizations for the sake of conversation, and they're sensitive topics, but it's good to talk about them. Let me give you a question though, because I feel like eminent domain is the solution. If the economic value is so high, it should be enough to buy folks out. They can walk away. They have the compensation. I mean, I'm sure it's still contentious to some degree, but I never see this used. Do you have any thoughts on this?
So zoning, I think, on the housing front kind of precludes it in that even if the government were to make the case to, take over a building, a plot of land, they're still not allowed to build the dense thing if the zoning disallows it. And this is where you've been able to see some kind of left YIMBYism. Some people who are more interested in having government build housing or social housing as opposed to the private market doing it, they've started to recognize, well, the government's not going to be able to build the housing either, putting the financing or taxation aside if the zoning doesn't allow it. So I think eminent domain could be a solution. I think eminent domain, I'm not an expert here, but it's also normally focused on kind of strategic individual projects that the government might want to do. I think, the border fence, eminent domain has been used some. I'm not sure you can necessarily make the case for individual housing projects that government should really eminent domain it. I guess, you could argue, a government could argue that the housing crisis is so bad and so, strategically, wrong and incoherent for the US that we need to start taking over people's land to build housing. But that's kind of dicey compared to we need to take over people's land to build a highway or some big infrastructure project.
So here's one other thought for you too. So we talked about Texas, some of the zoning going on, but another thing that Texas has going for it is that it has a lot of land and they work with large builders to build these, huge single family developments. Maybe so much so that that's been attributable to some of the drop in prices, that just so much supply has come online. But a lot of what you've been talking about is kind of like the urban situation or like the very close to urban situation. So one of the things that we see is people want these starter homes, these single family homes, and the new developments aren't going to have this contention, presumably. Is that the solution, or do you still think it's kind of a multifaceted approach?
So you're talking about sprawl. Sprawl has been the release valve, I'd say, for many years, and especially the last few years. You can think about these big developments, like you said, in Texas. If you're ever flying into Las Vegas, you can just see them go on for miles and miles in the desert outside of the city.
And they're still spinning them up around Nevada.
Yeah. And Phoenix as well, you can kind of see them. And they are a release valve. And often, they're big homes that are still kind of affordable, and families, especially now with remote work, can't afford them. There are certain limits, I think, to sprawl-based development for a couple reasons. The first one is non-insurance, and then I'll talk about an insurance one. When you're thinking about building infrastructure to serve a city or, a suburb or an exurb, there's more efficient ways to lay out, roads and pipes in a cost per unit basis. Because if you think about sprawl-based patterns, you need to send pipes, water infrastructure, roads into kind of far-flung regions. And the amount of piping or road per household is quite high because it's all so spread out. You can even think about with public services like fire protection, it's harder to service, farther and farther flung areas. So sprawl has been the answer for a while. And then on the insurance side, we're really seeing cats, especially in certain regions, hitting areas that they maybe wouldn't have been as densely populated before. So you mentioned with Texas, there's a lot of interesting analysis about these developments further and further outside of Dallas and Houston and San Antonio, Austin. They're getting hit by tornadoes and hailstorms. And these are big homes with big exposed roofs, sometimes cars that are out and exposed as well, in areas that used to just be kind of hitting farmland and farm silos. There's also some heat issues. It's not just severe convective storm. And then in California, we talk about California wildfire for many years. And some of that is certainly climate driven with drought and with buildup of fuel. But some of it's where the housing has been built in California for a long time. And it's further and further flung in the canyons and ravines and the chaparral that gets hit with these Santa Ana winds. And just like one ember can start, a big conflagration. So I don't want to say sprawl, should just be done away with. I think people are always going to want more space depending on their family situation, and they should have that option. But the cost, both to their kind of city, the insurance costs, it should reflect, the true cost, and it hasn't always done so. And then on the flip side, I think if you did allow cities, and not just the dense cities, but really the inner ring suburbs are where you also see some of the issues, thinking like a Palo Alto for San Francisco. If you do allow them to densify a bit as a safety valve, you don't need as much sprawl further and further out. And on the personal space, I do think consumer preference is a piece of it. A lot of people you want a yard, but how much yard do you want? If it was more affordable to live in an inner ring suburb where it was a suburb, a single family home, but a little bit more tightly packed, a lot of people might choose it if it was a lot cheaper. And some of the people who would choose that might choose to live in the middle of a city if the cost of a family-sized condo that has 3 or 4 bedrooms, a good amount of space is, half or 3/4 what it is today. So I like to see it as a gradient also to the start of your question. We sometimes think of urban, suburban, exurban as these being completely different worlds, but really it's a gradient in between. There's levels of density all across the spectrum.
So a question in a different angle now. Some of the cities are starting to experiment with new ways to fund infrastructure, so beyond the traditional taxes. Do you think that approach is sustainable, or how's that going to play out?
I'm actually less familiar on this area. I've maybe heard a little bit, like some cities have tried to experiment with land value taxation regimes, which tax the unimproved value of the land, which I think forces more intensive uses if the land is valuable. But I'm actually less familiar with some of the infrastructure funding regimes.
Okay, so where are you from? Where are you living right now? I have a question about that area.
Sure. Yeah. So I live in New York. I live in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I've been there for about 6 years.
Got a new mayor coming in?
Yes. So I talked about the politics a bit. I've gotten more involved in that area, volunteered on some campaigns. So we did have a very contentious Democratic primary earlier this year. That was in June. And for those who don't know, New York is a very Democratic city. And so really, whoever wins the Democratic primary is generally expected to win the then general election in November, because they're going to be up against a Republican who may have some support, but not enough to overcome, the big Democratic base in the city. So the Democratic primary for mayor was very contentious. A lot of people threw their hat in. And yes, there is a Democratic socialist candidate, Zohran Mamdani, who was able to get a lot of people excited and garner a lot of support and get a lot of turnout in what's an off-year election, because we were in the odd years in New York, not aligned with the presidential years. So he got a huge turnout among younger demographics who are not always the most politically engaged and can't always be counted on to come out and vote, unfortunately, in areas of Queens and Brooklyn, and was able to win the primary. And he has a really strong message around affordability. I mentioned he's a Democratic socialist, and that's something that's been waved in his face a lot against him, because that word scares people a lot. But in terms of his message to connect with people, he really stayed on point. Affordability, 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 because that's, like we've been talking about, the biggest issue facing New Yorkers, especially around housing. And then, fast forward to, we're recording this in November. We just had the general election and he won that. And so now we do have this interesting young dynamic figure. He's only 33 or 34, I think, coming into the mayoralty of the biggest city in the country, promising a lot around affordability and specifically housing. To get into policy, a rent freeze has been one of the biggest points he keeps hammering. You can really get into the weeds on rent control and rent stabilization in New York, but there's a regime of rent stabilization, which is...
Can you explain rent stabilization for folks?
Yes. So there are a lot of rent stabilized apartments in the city. I think it's something like 900,000 or a million. And some buildings are fully rent stabilized and some may be market rate, but they have like one rent stabilized apartment. And there is this board called the Rent Guidelines Board that the mayor selects that convenes once a year to look at the data around costs of maintaining multifamily housing, from utilities. Insurance is a big piece of it, and says, this is how much costs have gone up. This is what the building owner's margins look like. Here is the rent increase we're going to allow for these apartments for 1 and 2 year leases. So Mamdani is essentially saying, I'm going to have the Rent Guidelines Board freeze rent for the 4 years of my tenure. There's some question if he's allowed to actually do that, because the board is supposed to be independent, even though he selects them. They're supposed to look at the data. And a lot of multifamily housing that has a lot of rent stabilized units in New York is very troubled. A lot of these buildings are quite old, have a lot of big maintenance problems. We as an industry have raised insurance costs on them quite a bit. You'd say we're justified because a lot of these buildings are falling apart. And now saying that the owners aren't allowed to raise rents to cover any of these costs. But it's difficult because a lot of the people living in these buildings are very low income. A lot of them are clustered in the Bronx, where it's generally lower income, and people have been in these buildings sometimes for decades. So it's not easy politically one way or the other to say, allow these building owners to raise rents so they're not underwater, but it may lead to some people who don't earn a lot of money getting kicked out. But it's also not necessarily fair to the building owners or good for the broader market for housing to allow a bunch of buildings to fall into disrepair and then need to get taken over by the city or state. So that's kind of the biggest one. We've been talking about housing, but Mamdani he ran a good campaign. It wasn't just appealing to, left progressives, democratic socialists, to the more kind of red tape cutting center left people. He showed a lot of olive branches. He espoused a much greater openness to private development. He said, my thinking's really changed on it, and we do need private developers. He's pointed to zoning and some of the process stuff we've been talking about as being an issue for bringing housing production online. The mayor can only do so much. A lot depends on who he appoints in his government. So a lot of us who are in the weeds are looking very closely at the deputy mayors that he's going to select. As we record this, he has a transition team and they're starting to look at people for that. So
yeah, never really want to over-index too much on he won because of affordability. But it really does seem like, there's a huge affordability crisis in a lot of places, but predominantly New York. And Donald Trump made huge gains in New York City last time. And that's kind of the best way to square those two trends, as they were both talking about affordability. But I have nothing to do with New York. I don't mind who New York elects as their mayor. But most of us who took basic economics know about price caps and the unintended consequences that can come from this. I've seen videos where, again, to your point, and I don't know how prevalent this is, but you just see empty apartments that are rent stabilized. It's more economical to just let them sit empty because you can't repair them. But, I don't know. I think the U.S. is going to watch this and kind of see the experiment, or also going to see how much latitude the governor affords him. Any predictions? We can come back 1 year later and
yeah. So for some of the buildings I was talking about, the really distressed rent stabilized buildings, I gather things are going to get worse before they get better. And some of these are going to fall into disrepair, need to be taken over by the state or nonprofits because they're kind of already there. There is a changing environment in the state. I think the governor has recognized it as well, that we need to allow more building and more density, especially in New York. She is somewhat constrained, though, because she doesn't just deal with New York City. She deals with the suburbs, especially Long Island. And a lot of those suburbs don't want to see densification. Some of the forces we were talking about before are strongest in the Long Island suburbs. They were some of the earliest suburbs as we think of them. And so those forces are big. She has in the last few years proposed kind of big housing compacts to allow more building throughout the state, but it's always failed because of suburban opposition. So things are probably going to get worse before they get better. And there's going to be incremental changes that will hopefully bear fruit and then change people's thinking. One example that passed last year in New York is a big citywide upzoning called the City of Yes, which does allow more densification throughout the city gradually, allowing more development near transit stops by right, allowing more accessory dwelling units, which is like your granny flats by right. Town center zoning, as it's called, which is residential above commercial.
Mm-hmm.
And you're already seeing some projects starting to be proposed and built because that upzoning went through. So Mamdani and Hochul, our governor, they may actually get some credit for some of the building that's happening as a result of the package that was passed by Adams, our previous mayor.
Yeah, getting worse before it gets better is maybe not the most optimistic ending, but I think we're all curious how it will go. Yeah,
I think you have to change people's thinking and the conversation, the politics side of it, before you can really get the political change, because the leaders, they follow where public opinion is.
Yeah.
So we're working hard down at the advocacy level to change the thinking, get good people elected. And I've seen a lot of change just in the last couple of years. So I am optimistic the conversation's changing quickly, but it takes time to build things.
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here. And we have so much more to talk about. We definitely have to have you back for another episode soon. I do know you wanted to share some recommended reading. So I want to make sure you get a chance to let our listeners know what they could be reading to be ready for the next episode.
Yes, I'll get this out. But I was sort of hinting at this. One book really interesting is called Stuck. It came out this year. It has a subtitle, Stuck, How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. That really gets into the history of American mobility and how it has been stifled in the last few decades. So very, very deep on the kind of history of zoning and the individuals who are really pushing it and the actual personalities, which I think was kind of fascinating. I'll shout out Abundance, which is big bestseller this year, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. This is what I would say is kind of a political manifesto for that kind of center-left view on our blue areas that are somehow the most progressive are the worst on building things, and why is that? And we need to think about a progressivism that builds and doesn't just focus too much on process. Another book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. It's by Mark Dunkelman. It's a little bit of a longer term history of progressive politics and how it could do big things in the past, like during the FDR New Deal era, but then took a turn towards really focusing on smallness and reining in power in the 70s with some of the things I talked about. It kind of goes deep on the policy changes and history behind that. I'm going to do one more. I know we're over time, but for techier people, Recoding America is a really interesting book by Jennifer Palka. It's about how government systems and technology are not good and why that is, why outdated processes make it hard for the government to kind of do good tech and just deliver on services. So I'll stop there. There's more.
And of course, your papers as well, I feel like.
Yes, please read the actuarial review. People work very hard on it. I think it's a great publication that the CAS puts out every 2 months. But I did an article on zoning. I think it was Navigating New Urban Realities last year. I wrote an article on the parametric insurance market this year. And I would encourage any actuaries listening, if you want to volunteer, definitely write or edit for actuarial review. It's a good way to build your network and clarify your thinking and ability to kind of produce ideas.
One of the unintended consequences of this podcast is my reading list is growing exponentially. But out of those 5 recommendations, I have read your article. So at least 20% done with this list. But yeah, thank you, DJ. Great having you.
Thank you very much.
So when we were chatting with DJ, we were on the run to the airport to catch a flight. We've had some time to reflect on this conversation. I thought it was very fascinating, but clearly we have a lot more to talk about with DJ. I look forward to having him back. And Max, I wanted to get your thoughts on how this will potentially tie into insurance as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, we only got to like half of the questions that we had, so definitely got to get DJ back. And yeah, it's interesting because it feels relevant. It's just not totally clear, like in the short term, what the takeaway is. Like, I think it's an interesting conversation, and it's very obvious that in some way, shape, or form, this is going to impact insurance. I'm just not 100% sure, like, what the next step would be. It feels so dynamical that it's like, depending on how the debate goes and which side of that debate wins, it probably could have a different impact for us.
I want to hear from you. Like, if you have thoughts, questions, any spicy takes about housing and how it intersects with insurance, please email us at podcast@casact.org.
I will say this episode was recorded before Zohran Mamdani went to the White House and met with President Trump. So very interesting meeting, but again, probably better suited for the next one. But don't forget to like, share, and follow Almost Nowhere. We'll be back soon with another episode exploring how actuarial thinking shapes the world around us. Thanks, everyone.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Casualty Actuarial Society, its subsidiaries, or the employers of the hosts and guests. This podcast may discuss topics related to insurance and regulatory issues, but the information shared should not be considered as legal or regulatory advice.